When they come to Detroit, although it's not the same as the South, housing was segregated. There were certain areas where African Americans could live and own property, including businesses. And the major area that was the Lower East Side. The residential area was known as Black Bottom, and the business section was known as Paradise Valley.
In spite of these barriers, 1 million new residents are drawn to the city. And one of the few places everyone can mix is the factory floor. The auto industry booms. The city soon becomes home to visionary entrepreneurs: Cadillac, Chevrolet, Chrysler, Packard, and more, earning Detroit its nickname, the Motor City.
So this is a visit back home. So there's my grandmother next to my grandfather's car. If I was a car guy, I would be able to just look at that and tell you that is a 1948 Oldsmobile, but I'm not a car guy, so I can't do that.
Neither am I. But here we are in the Motor City.
Right.
I'm sure someone in our audience is going to look at that and be able to say, boom, that's it.
That's it. So there's my grandmother taking a picture next to my grandfather's car.
Photos with our cars. We all have them. A symbol of the American dream. It defined progress and meant we'd made it. But in Detroit, with few lives untouched by the automobile industry, it meant even more.
This is my dad. He was about 18 or 19 years old at the time. And you might notice right next to him is a Victrola. And he would put on records, and the ladies would sit down and recline right in the middle of the canoe, and he would court them. He ended up working at Packard Motor Car Company. He really couldn't afford to buy the cars he was building. However, about 1948, Packard's had an excessive amount of extra cars, and so they lowered the price. So one day I came home, I was in the 2nd grade, I turned the corner, and there sitting in front of my house was this big, beautiful black piece of metal, and I said, Daddy got his car. Packard built this plant in 1903.
So this whole place was Packard?
This whole place.
And your dad worked here?
My dad worked at this plant for 20 years, from 1934 to 1954. He built cars here. He was a tool and gauge inspector. He didn't work at an office. There was a section right up there on the 3rd floor.
So your dad was up there?
Up there. He'd come in on the other side, come all the way through, and he'd work up there. And you know what? What you see here is trees. All this was a Packard parking lot.
And do you have a picture of your dad?
This is a picture of my dad. This is his badge for him to get into the plant.
This is his Packard ID.
ID badge. I just happened to find this in a box about 25, 30 years ago. And I said, wow, Pop, you saved this. So.
That's funny because it's now part of your family photo album.
This is exactly it. This is exactly it.
Packard and its plant shuttered in 1958, unable to compete with the larger and more dominant car companies.
My grandmother was born in Southern Illinois, coal mining father and stay-at-home mom. And this is her. And eventually, after she got married, they moved to Detroit. Very quickly after they got here, they worked in the auto industry. They heard that there was the $5 a day, and they came up here, and it wasn't the promised land because of the conditions. Then they just became so involved in unions. That was her life. That became her life. My grandmother was in and out of prison a number of times. They thought that would stop her from her activities, but nothing stopped. My grandmother was the feistiest person I've ever met. At that time, it was so important. It was really human rights. And I think Detroit was the perfect place for that to be happening. She was just this radical person that found a place and that she was appreciated for her feistiness.
Detroit would also make significant cultural breakthroughs over the years, most notably in music. Berry Gordy's Motown is the most well-known example, but Detroit was making music even earlier. In Black Bottom on Hastings Street, another dream unfolds. To satisfy uprooted Southerners hungry for music from home. The place? The legendary record store of Joe Von Battle. Marsha Music is a poet and performer, and his youngest daughter. When you see all these images, what comes to mind?
When I see them all amassed like this, it really touches me regarding the fullness of family and the journey of my family. Well, here is a photograph of my father in the early days. That is the very year that he opened up the record store in 1945. He was dedicated to selling near an area called Black Bottom. And Black Bottom was the area of the city, particularly in the 1940s, largely made up of people who wanted to hear their Southern music. And that Southern music was primarily the blues.
The blues.
They came to the North escaping segregation, ended up in the North, trapped by segregation, and they had the blues.
Oh, but a long, long way from home, oh yeah.
So this photograph of this little girl,
Yes,
could this be you?
it could be. It could be me. It is me. I was apparently standing in front of my dad's record store on Hastings Street. In its years in the 1940s and early 50s, people walked up and down the street playing music. And my dad began to record these people. He captured the sounds of the time in Detroit.
Wow, so he would record people speaking or doing
Yes.
whatever.
He would sometimes just record railroad sounds or street sounds. He also recorded many, many people. We didn't realize the significance of these people, though. They were just our dad's old friends. We didn't realize that some of these people would become iconic artists. John Lee Hooker, people like Della Reese. He popularized the sermons of the Reverend C.L. Franklin. And then later on, his daughter, with that amazing voice that she had. He was the very first to record her voice, and he produced her very first gospel records as she led the choir or as she sang alone. She would go to the record shop after church and hang around with my older brothers and sisters there. So Joe's Record Shop was a place that was really, really teeming with creativity.
We can carry that, those two. Exactly, all that.
My friend Overton Lloyd, who did the album covers for George Clinton, told me there was going to be an audition for the Brides of Funkenstein in Detroit. I brought my resume, my tapes.
And what kind of music were you sharing at that point?
I was doing the little tape that I had. So it was like, oh, hey, Mr. Melody, you're on my mind constantly, and I think of you the whole day long. That's the stuff I was singing on the tape. So I was like classical, had these glasses, violin, nerdy girl, and the Funkadelics, what? And so I got the gig, and I got to the rehearsal hall, and they opened up the door, and it was just musicians everywhere. They looked like aliens. They had One Nation scarves on. They just big boot, army boot. They looked like soldiers. They just were funky. And I was like, wow. And I immediately sat down. This was Wednesday. And we just rehearsed around the clock for 1 week. And then I walked out on stage in Pittsburgh in front of 10,000 people. And they looked like this big. And, well, hey, Walter, whatever they're doing in the skull. And George would walk by, and I was just like a whole new world.
Touring with P-Funk launches Satori, and she takes artistic flight around the world, leaving Detroit behind. Doreen, Satori's younger sister, stays in Detroit and is the keeper of the family photos. We catch up with both sisters at United Sound Studios, where some of Detroit's iconic tracks were cut.
You know, when I look at this picture of my mother, and I look at her eyes, you know, that's a story in there. She was a maid. She came up from Hollybuff, Mississippi, that was in Yazoo County, one of the most racist counties in the South. She went to Barber Junior High School, but she was 17 in the 9th grade because she picked cotton, and she was ashamed that she was so much older than the other kids, so she quit school and became a maid in Grosse Pointe. My goal was to be like Diana Ross. Mama said, Diana Ross is special. Because she thought Diana Ross was special, but I thought I was pretty special too. I didn't think I was special, I just thought if Diana Ross did it, why couldn't I do it?
So she was in some ways not a literal obstacle, but she was...
I saw her as an obstacle because I wanted to live. And she was like, no, come back, don't, you gotta be safe.
I have a different understanding because I was mama's girl. She could do no wrong in my eyes. She was my everything because I felt like she sacrificed so much for us. She cleaned houses so that we could, you know, take music lessons or, you know, go to the movie or learn how to skate. And so she was everything to me.
In the 50s, it seemed that Black life wanted to imitate Ozzie and Harriet and wanted to have that middle-class upbringing. There were big picnics, and once a month we would get in a car and go out to dinner. That was like a big deal. And there was value, shared values, and we all knew what they were, from the church to the school to the people in the neighborhood. There was value of community. Kindness, respect, those kinds of values.
Detroit's economy was booming, and the rising income created another radical innovation: the middle class.
This is my dad. That's taken at the Sears and Roebucks that used to be in Highland Park, and they took this picture. It's one of my favorite pictures of my dad. Okay, that's a real Detroit, I work at Chrysler tank plant picture. Working at Chrysler used to be the thing. My dad retired out of Chrysler at 60 years old. And we had a really good life back then. I owned property when people could have a good life in Detroit.
Living in the historic Boston Edison neighborhood, we had a lot of middle-class people, teachers and people who worked in the plant, you know, all kinds of folks. It was always a given that we would complete our educations beyond high school.
Absolutely. One of the stories that my sister tells is that when we were in like kindergarten, first grade, you may not have known what college was, but you knew you were going there.
Yeah, I knew what a PhD was
right,
in kindergarten. So.
Right, there's no question.
During that time in Detroit, the Black middle class was definitely doing very, very well.
Absolutely.
So, and we were a part of that legacy.
The middle class was thriving, but there were still only a handful of places where the different ethnic groups could mix.
Who are these folks?
This is my grandfather, Moses Ross. So that's him right there. And this is my grandmother, Lucinda Ross, and these are two of their friends. And they're at the Club Plantation, which is one of the important historic clubs in Paradise Valley. And the clubs were known as Black and Tans, which means that they serviced both African Americans and white patrons. And they did not segregate them. So African Americans and whites could sit right next to each other at a Paradise Valley club. But in most other places, African Americans and whites could not sit together, and many times African Americans could not even be in those clubs. And they really start booming by the 1930s and 40s, when the top music of that day was big band jazz.
These photos are full of that good life. The clothes, the attitudes, the headliners. Boxing champ Joe Louis is here. Singer Cab Calloway.
The Beyonce of the 1930s was Count Basie and Duke Ellington and Billie Holiday. That's what you would have heard mostly on radio stations. This is where you would hear it at all the clubs, the 606 Horseshoe Lounge, the Club 360, Club Congo, the Apex Bar. You would have heard it here. And if you wanted to hear it every day, you came to Paradise Valley.
But the tension from Detroit's segregation and racism was reaching a boiling point. It's all right there in the images. Eruptions of violence. Whole neighborhoods obliterated in the name of urban renewal. Even Joe's record shop is forced to reopen on 12th Street when Black Bottom is destroyed by a new highway. And in 1967, on the corner of 12th Street in Claremont, Detroit's systemic policies of aggressive policing, discrimination, and overcrowding turned an altercation with undercover detectives into an explosion.
At the time the riots hit in July of '67, I was 6. I will never forget my mom saying, "Don't even think about leaving this house."
When the Detroit riots hit, I was 10. My dad was a firefighter. I never really realized how dangerous his job was until that moment.
I said, "Diane, there's a riot going on. This is a whole black neighborhood and you're living in a white apartment. They don't allow blacks in. You're going to be in trouble." She says, "I know, but I'm not leaving this apartment because I got a brand new television."
You can hear bullets. The troops were going up and down the street, down to the boulevard. They will circle to the boulevard and come up 12th Street. The trucks and all the troops, and you can hear them. They shot out the lights, you know, on the streets. The troops were patrolling this whole area.
Like once a week?
Oh, no, every hour on the hour. I mean, they were just going up in town, you know, so they had their M16s, you know, on the back and their military things.
For those who lived through it, 1967 is a watershed experience. And the photos are haunting.
I remember during that time, Detroit had a policing unit, and they were out in full force. And I remember my brother.
His brother? That's him. Dale Whitney.
He was out with some friends, probably weren't doing the right thing. And he said police began to chase them, and they began running. And shots were fired, and he got hit. He got hit in the shoulder. But he said he hid, you know, and just was like praying, "Please let me live."
This is this brother. This is the one. He lived.
But there was actual danger.
The sad part about it is that you knew your business was down on 12th Street or some of the areas, and there were people that did go down with shotguns to protect their business, but the National Guard chased them out. They didn't want any other guns in the city. And then folks came back and their businesses were all burned out.
The 12th Street store was looted initially.
So even though it was a black business,
Yes.
people still broke in?
Yes. There's a picture of the looting. It shows people kind of standing in line, very orderly. My father was really brokenhearted because he felt that if he had been able to stay there and protect his store and stay with his store, it would not have been destroyed.